So one of the reasons this conference has worked so well and we have such great attendance is our important sponsorship and our collaborations with industry and the ecosystem we have here in Minnesota and nationally and internationally now with all the groups that are doing medical device innovation. And every year, since we've more or less started, we've identified individuals to be the DMD Conference Award winner. And these individuals are really ambassadors and champions of the University of Minnesota that come to us from industry. And this year's award winner is Dr. Teri Whitman. And I'm going to give a little intro, so don't run up just yet. But she's actually going to describe her academic journey, so I'm not going to describe that. But you know, she's done a lot for us here at the U. She's always been here as a participant in the Design of Medical Device Conference. She's organized many, many sessions here over the years, both as a chair of it, but she's also been a speaker in many of the sessions. She's helped organize the Medtronic booth, and for everybody that comes here and organizes the booth, this is not, you know, you just come here and show up. It takes some coordination, and we appreciate all the companies that do that. And Teri was bringing in stuff for hers this morning, so I know the role and the contributions the companies make and how critical that is for it as well. And so thanks for doing that. She's now organizing the sponsorship for DMD from Medtronic for us. Again, we wouldn't be having this nice meal and all this activity without, you know, corporate sponsorship. So individuals like Teri, it's critical that we continue to do that. But as just as a champion, you know, for the university, she's been recognized as a innovation fellow of the Institute for Engineering Medicine. So we can count on her for input and how the institutes run, give us advice on that. She's sponsored a lot of senior design projects over the years in biomedical engineering and been a mentor for these student teams. She has also sponsored a half a dozen new product design and business development projects, which are 2-semester graduate level projects, and mentored the team through that. And that's extra effort on all the people that mentor those. So again, you know, without those kind of collaborations and connections, we really, you know, wouldn't have these really unique programs happening at the U. She's taken on a lot of interns from the U and, you know, hired a lot of university grads. She has been a strong collaborator with the Visible Heart Lab, so I've had a privilege to work with Teri, you know, on a weekly, monthly basis for a number of years. We won't tell anybody how long, but it's been a long time. So again, she's very deserving of this. She's a big champion of the University of Minnesota and ambassador. But you know, Teri and I have also a really unique connection. We're probably the only two people in this room that have publications in meat science on PSC pork. And I will let her finish the rest of that story. And it's 2 different publications. It's not a joint publication either. So just kind of a unique little side note there. So with that, Teri, we're looking forward to your insights and your wisdom.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you, Paul. And you know, over the years, it really has been a pleasure to be able to collaborate down with the University of Minnesota. I think it's something we take for granted, really, in the medical device industry, that we have a world-class educational system like in our backyard. And you know, some of my play with finances in the budget is for some of these programs is I really look at student interactions as part of our flexible workforce, or that's what I tell my boss. So, you know, for a pretty small fee, you can get 8 to 10 very talented graduate students and their advisors, in many cases, to work on projects that are mutually interesting to both industry and the academic side. So today, I'm hoping that you'll indulge me a little bit as I talk about my journey, because I think it informs why I'm passionate about what we do here. And I just gotta say, being back at DMD after a few years of things being weird, it's so nice to be back with my people. And there's just a great keynote this morning and a great session on pediatric innovations. Man, this is just refreshing to the soul. So glad to be back. And so I'm going to tell you a little story about how I got to be in biomedical engineering. So I am a ranch girl from Wyoming, and I grew up on a cattle ranch. So I don't know, I think all of us, especially those who are in grad school right now, are trying to figure out the what you do. What kind of problems do I like to solve? So I always thought that I would go into food engineering for some reason. Maybe it was because my mom would say things like, you know, when you become a design engineer, you're gonna like design a stove that actually makes sense. Clearly this was designed by some man who has never cooked before. So I just offended probably half of the audience and threw my mom under the bus. But after undergrad, I wrote a proposal to NSF, and my problem statement was, I'm gonna build a better hot dog. And either because of that or in spite of that, I got to be an NSF fellow, and I went to Purdue University, which is also a land-grant university, to work in food engineering. And for the grad students out there, this was a pretty good gig. You got to eat your results. Pace pecani sauce, I brought home gallons and gallons of pecani sauce. My husband and I, we ate pork chops for about a year. And so the problem that I wanted to solve, it turns out, was in malignant hyperthermia. So unintentionally, we had been breeding pigs that shared a trait with malignant hyperthermia. So these animals were heavily muscled, and malignant hyperthermia is a problem with skeletal muscle. So skeletal muscle becomes the meat we eat. And in this case, like under stress, like perhaps someone having to give a presentation in front of all these engineers and scientists, under stress, this could trigger, because of a leaky ryanodine receptor, it turns out, stress can trigger a massive metabolic reaction. So what would happen in these animals, it would cause what looked like sudden cardiac death, it turns out, massive loss of livestock in some cases, so it's an animal care issue. So anytime during transport or through the slaughter process, it could trigger this reaction. So the body starts to go into anaerobic glycolysis, temperature goes up abnormally because it's burning all sorts of ATP as the calcium that can't be taken out of the sarcolemma starts to contract. So these animals would go into this massive metabolic reaction. And so there were several ways to go about solving this. Some was just genetically selecting it out of your herd. So you could do that. I got to share a session with Temple Grandin at the Meat Science program one year, because she, of course, was looking at ways to design the animal handling facilities. But I was interested in rapid detection. So if you could come up with sensors, I was an engineer, I wanted to come up with sensors, like temperature sensors, pH sensors, impedance sensors, that could give an early detection that something bad was going on, that proteins were being denatured. And your cells, of course, are a mixture You have an extracellular space, and then you have a lipid bipolar layer that's very capacitive. So the thought was, I could use impedance. And so for those of you who've worked on impedance out there in the audience, you know that impedance is an indirect measurement. It's sensitive to pretty much everything and specific to not much. So after months and months of research, I had a lot of data that was garbage, and I really didn't understand why. And so I needed an expert. And in the years before Google, if you can even remember that, you'd spend a lot of time in the library photocopying journal articles, and at the end of the IEEE articles, there would be a little bio about the professor, right? And I was at Purdue, and I was reading all of these articles by this guy that said his bio said he was retired, and I thought, that is a tragedy. Like, he's retired, and I can't meet him. So this L.A. Geddes, who I must have read 10, 15 articles, the godfather of bioimpedance. And so I asked one day one of my professors in food engineering, I'm like, you work at the Potter Center. Like, have you ever met this guy? And he's like, yeah, his office is 2 down for me. Do you want to meet him tomorrow? I thought, all right, yeah. So I showed up in the morning, and I met the guy, and this was the day I became a biomedical engineer. So Dr. Geddes had basically put down what he was doing and was fascinated by the fact that I was measuring skeletal muscle in pigs for meat quality. I mean, I think he was fascinated by the whole story. He actually helped me solve my problem pretty quickly, because in impedance measurements, if you're injecting current into, biological aqueous medium, really what's happening at the electrode interface is really most of what you're measuring. So I got a tetrapolar circuit from him, and that kind of solved the problem. And then the rest of the day happened, which was, and I found this quote from him when I was looking for a picture of him, because I did, like the old pictures on the IEEE, like are all fuzzy. I'm like, oh, yeah. So this is Dr. Geddes, and he gave an interview in 2000 that I thought was pretty fascinating, and it resonates pretty deeply with me, because it's what I experienced there, and it's what I experience here at the University of Minnesota. And his quote, and he was the department head, this was the culture of the place. I'll help anybody who has an inclination to do something. If anyone in the lab gets a new idea, we'll drop everything and help him or her do the first experiment. We want to turn out people who are useful to society, and in particular, useful to industry, right? People who make things. And this guy has 890 academic publications, and what was an important output from his lab is the engineers of the future. So it turns out that malignant hyperthermia is a problem that also impacts people, which I wasn't sure that I knew anything about. And so the same thing happens. Instead of stress of transport, it could be the stress of standing up here and delivering a talk, or under anesthesia. Volatile anesthesias for people who are predisposed and carry this gene can cause a massive metabolic reaction that, if you don't detect it early enough, can lead to organ failure and death. And this means like within the 30 minutes, 1 hour of your procedure. And this research group at Purdue, he blew my mind that they had a medical solution that was looking at an early detection, but because they had expired CO2, they were looking at things like body temperature, CO2, and they had an early detection that saved babies. So for the rest of the afternoon, he was like, well, do you want to stay? Do you want to see a tour of the lab? I said, yeah. And in the next door, they were doing an experiment on defibrillation, which of course you know, if you've never seen, you know, a heart completely stopped and resuscitated, like I'd never seen anything like it in my life. And then I asked to stay a little longer. And so that day I changed from a food science major, food engineer. Don't get me wrong, I still am a huge meat snob and I really like a good steak, but I decided that I would stay in biomedical device research. So that is my origin story and why I am pretty passionate about what we do here in DMD, which is this academic and industrial cross-collaboration. So who designs the next devices? They can come from anywhere, and so if you look at your table of 10, you know, 30% maybe students here. We've got 20% of professors, clinicians, make up maybe 15% in the crowd. This is the last couple of years of data, so it might not be accurate for today. This was the last couple of years. And industry makes up about 30. We've also got representatives from the government, from the FDA, from the military, and from legal and IP patent lawyers I know here in the crowd. And so I want to remind you, like, you know, we've heard a little bit about this in other talks this morning. You know, we are doing a very collaborative effort here, trying to bring a medical device into market. It's not just about an idea, it's about the business model, it's everything that it takes to bring technology to the patient and make a patient's life better. So our origin story at Medtronic, you know, is a thing of legend with Medtronic and the University of Minnesota, so I won't tell all of that here, but Earl Bakken was our founder and an engineer who had a very close working relationship with Dr. Walt Lillihei, who was a cardiologist, and of course the friends and family, I think it was given the name earlier in a session, friends and family. His brother-in-law, Palmer Hermansley, was the business side. How do we make this into a business? And of course, the business that Earl Bakken and Walt Lillihei conspired to create was a battery-operated pacemaker. And you see it on this little boy, you know, at the bottom. We don't always remember the name of the patient, and the patient's name is David Williams. And so as we think about this ecosystem, you know, it's not just the cardiologists and physicians and healthcare providers and payers and reimbursement. The patient is at the center of all this. We wouldn't be doing it if it wasn't for the benefit of the patient. So a little bit of what I do. I now lead I'm a director in our cardiac rhythm management group at Medtronic in the Cardiac Implantables division. So, you know, these are kind of the big pillars of what we do: implantable defibrillation systems, so when your heart's getting a little too fast, we call that tachy. Cardiac pacing therapies, so bradycardias, and cardiovascular diagnostics. In this, what I'm showing here is our implantable link device that measures things like cardiac rhythms, impedance, and arrhythmias for rapid detection to help physicians diagnose and get the right kind of therapy to the patient. So in my big funnel of things, as we are early research, you know, it includes things like patient selection and how we design the new delivery systems and procedures. So it starts out as a very big funnel. Those ideas come from everywhere, from our physician collaborators, from our academic collaborators, from students, from internal. So it is definitely, you know, things like the DMD conference, right, is a great place for us to understand what else is going on. Get your blinders off a little bit, look around and see what interesting things are being done in other adjacencies. So the major drivers, and I figured by this time I'm probably running a little long, so four, maybe three. Minimally invasive therapies. I lead a team that works on minimally invasive therapies, and what does that mean? There's a big interplay, right, between miniaturizing our devices and procedure innovation. And just to walk you through an example, in 1989, our implantable device was about 200 cc's. The electrodes had to be placed in an open chest procedure and sewn on the heart. So the defibrillation went between those two electrodes, and the device was large and only lasted 3 or 4 years. And patients stayed in the hospital sometimes for weeks, and the survival rate certainly wasn't 100%. These were very sick patients, and then they had to undergo a very massive surgery to get their defibrillator. So in this next era, certainly downsizing the battery, the capacitors, making the devices last longer at the same time and be smarter, as well as the discovery of new materials. We were able to put the electrode in the heart and make the return electrode for defibrillation, because it requires 2 electrodes, the other electrode set up in the pectoral region. So now, like today, you can see the progression of every kind of 7 years, how much smaller the device gets, how much longer it lasts. Today, someone can go in the morning to get their defibrillator. It takes 45 minutes, and they're home by the afternoon. So this downsizing, this is all done closed chest under local anesthesia now, when it used to be certainly general anesthesia. And this downsizing has allowed us to discover different ways that we might apply that same therapy, but it may be helpful to the patient to get the hardware outside their venous vasculature. For long term. So this is a device that we have under clinical study. It is not yet approved in the US, but in Europe. It's called the extravascular substernal ICD. The electrode, in this case, actually tunnels under the sternum, and the electrode sits on your axilla, like right here. And so the shock vector is now different, but because our energies are higher, this allows us to keep our electrodes out of the vasculature. And the same storyline goes for pacemakers, right? So the young man that had to hold his own pacemaker, right? He had to hold his own therapy. David Williams is shown up here on the left with Dr. Lily High. So that's the first pacemaker in 1958. And really, the downsizing and the implantability marched forward. And so you see in 2011, you've got a device that's on the order of 10 cc's that, slips under your skin. But in 2016, we really had a revolution, right? A sort of a paradigm shift in how we deliver therapies. The device, the batteries, and the electronics are small enough so the entire pacemaker can fit in your heart. So from a reliability standpoint, now you don't have a distributed system of electrodes. It's higher in reliability. It eliminates the pocket for the patients and makes life better. For many of these patients, they don't even know they have a pacemaker and keeping their heart going. So this was the procedural revolution, if you will. Instead of implanting from above, we're now implanting from below through the femoral vein with an entirely new introducer system and delivery system that was designed, like nothing that we had before in our portfolio. So the capsule is delivered up to the right atrium. The catheter pulls a curve and puts it down in the apical region on the septum. And this just shows kind of the complexity of our delivery system and the physician deploying the micra into the heart. And this is exciting, and an example of our collaboration with the Visible Heart Lab. You can see what the device looks like as it interacts, the tines and the fixation interacts with myocardial tissue. So once the physician has got the device implanted, it can check the electricals through radio frequency telemetry. And when the physician is satisfied that the device is placed where he wants it, he can cut the tether, and the whole system comes out, the delivery system comes out of the femoral vein, and a stitch is put in. And there's no, for the patient, there's no external reminder that they're carrying a device. So, this is the direction that we want to go, right? You can see that it's not just good for adults. Of course, I still have a pretty big passion for pediatrics, and you can see as we march down in size, it starts to look more and more like something that our pediatrics would be appropriate for our pediatric patients as well. So the second tenet, of course, is making people feel better. Right now, we put in the definitive treatment for sudden cardiac death, which is a defibrillator. And we know that defibrillators in a population of someone with coronary artery disease that has had low pump function, we know that defibrillators save 50% of patients' lives compared to a population without the defibrillator. However, only 20% of the patients at the 2-year mark, only about 20% have received any sort of therapy from their device. And so the question is, if they're carrying around this device to protect them from something that we're not quite sure when will happen, what else should the device be doing? And there's a lot of effort, of course, to look at different pacing modalities. How can we engage things like the conduction system to provide a more physiologic contraction? And we know that this improves hospitalization in patients as well. And then sensors, other things, other smarts we can put into the device that can help clinicians detect and treat and head off problems, or the patient can head off their own problems if they've had too much salt for dinner, and they can get some feedback on their status before they turn the corner and need to head to the hospital for an intervention. And finally, number 3 is finding the patients who need our cardiac therapies. We have a diverse population that's aging, has more comorbidities. We know that birthdays, the number of birthdays also kind of goes along with this. You're more at risk from sudden cardiac arrest, but we've seen this year, at least in the US, some very public examples of people collapsing during football games and the whole nation watching while CPR is being delivered and a shock is being administered. So we know that in the US alone, and this, multiply this by 4 or 5 probably worldwide, is that 300,000 people have sudden cardiac arrest. 70% of these events happen at home. Most of them are unwitnessed. And for every minute delay in resuscitation, your probability of survival goes down by 10% every minute. And so only 10% of patients survive their sudden cardiac death event. And we know that if you survive, you were 3 times more likely to get bystander CPR and have someone, a bystander, deliver the AED shock. And I pulled up a graph from a device that we made a few years ago called Chronicle ICD that had both the electrogram up top and had right ventricular pressure, just to show you when a patient goes into a ventricular tachycardia, sometimes it happens very abruptly and the pressure goes in the right heart from like 35 millimeters of mercury, down to 5. And we know that this particular patient collapsed, but because this patient had an ICD, in 15 seconds, a shock was delivered and survived. So how do we get more people protected from this going on? We know that there's certainly a genetic, like malignant hyperthermia, there's many times a genetic reason why families are susceptible to sudden cardiac death. There's more and more sports physical clinics that are going up around the US. Get your kids in and get them screened. As many times, athletics will also reveal some of these problems. And then faster ways to deliver CPR and AEDs, as the engineers in the room, how do we find these people who need them? I mentioned that we have a diagnostic division. There's certainly the Apple Watches out there too, right, that has crash detect. They're already dialing 911. And this definitely does need to be a partnership, though, with government agency and EMS agencies, because, of course, I went down a rabbit hole and started reading, like, how many people at Vail. There was, 50 EMS, because all the skiers had Apple Watches and no one hit I didn't really crash or it didn't really fall button. So it can overwhelm our systems if we don't administer this correctly. And this is obviously only a solution for those who can afford a $400 watch. Right, so what do we do for the rest of the world and thrifty ideas? I loved this one. You know, in Sweden, there's a whole effort. There's a company called Everdrone that had its very first save this last year. So guy collapses from shoveling snow in Sweden, and the guy that's driving by and sees the guy collapsed in his front yard happened to be a physician, which sometimes helps. Gets you through it. He calls their equivalent of 911. They call a drone, and they call the EMS at the same time. The drone gets there first. The doctor uses the AED on the patient and has a save. So I just find this like amazing, a drone dropping an AED out of the sky. But those are the kinds of things I think we're going to need to think about for how do we protect our people in the United States and in the world. We don't all live in urban areas. You know, there's a wide difference in our population and our access to medical therapies. So the last, and I want to leave you with this, it's, you know, a major driver is this audience, you and your why. Multidisciplinary collaborations have to happen between academia and industry and our healthcare providers and our government payers and incentives from the government and our manufacturers, and most importantly, the patients. And I want to tell you a story because, you know, over the years, I have worked a lot in significant risk research. And a few years ago, my team we were doing a research project that patients signed up for extra episodes of fibrillation and defibrillation for a clinical study, knew the risks, and yet somehow they were going to receive no benefit from this study. And yet patients signed up. And as one of the patients was leaving the room, he was awake and he looked at their team and he said, "Did you get what you needed? Did you get all the data that you needed?" He's like, I hope so. He's like, if it weren't for medical devices, it worked for medical research, I wouldn't have gotten the chance to be a father. And I always think like, wow, what we do is so important, and we have a partnership, you know, together as technologists, medical care professionals, and those patients, of course, are our fathers, our kids, our siblings, and we need to do our job well. So, to wrap it up, Paul, so today, one thing that I want you to do is meet someone new and ask, you know, what problems do you solve? I've had a 26-year career so far in the medical device industry, and it happened because someone made an introduction for me. You know, I knocked on somebody's door, and they were receptive, and then I asked to stay. Most people are very much, engineers love to talk about the problems that we're solving, and they would love to suck you into that solution. So make sure you go and find something adjacent to what you're working on today and ask a few questions. So, thanks.
We're gonna, of course, have you answer a few questions, but
good.
You know, I think you could have a second career as a motivational speaker.
Okay.
Because I'm ready to get to work now.
Well, we got a long afternoon.
I'm not surprised why you have such a productive team. You didn't answer the question though. What is your sensoric evaluation of pale, soft, exudative pork?
Oh.
But you know, we'll leave that for
bad.
later.
It's bad. We should all avoid it.
Anyhow, do we have questions from the audience? Oh, come on. Oh, there's one. There we go. The microphone's coming to you. Hang on. and the rest of you start thinking.
I found the story about the drone delivery of an AED interesting. I lost a Boy Scout some years ago. I'm a Scout leader, and lost one to sudden cardiac death.
Oh.
So in thinking about that, do you foresee a day when there will be home AEDs, like we would see a home use fire extinguisher?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is already, you know, we always say there's a in research, right? Sometimes these ideas have been around and then didn't make sense from a technology standpoint, or they're too expensive. But again, I think as the price point comes down on AEDs, as we're more and more connected and know where they are. I don't know, my house, like if you came in wanting to find the AED, good luck, right? And so you'd have to have some sort of system that would tell your neighbors where your AED was. So yeah, I do. I think that the number of saves that we had, I mean, we saw a very public save, you know, not too many weeks ago on the football field. AEDs save lives, and get out there. Everyone should be certified on CPR. I mean, you can almost take just a video class to do it. So yes, I think it's coming, and I think, you know, even in the remote, in the boundary waters, you know, getting an AED, there are solutions to that. Yeah, I think it's coming.
Other questions? Oh, way back.
Oh,
Here.
yes.
We have another one here.
There's
Okay.
one time. Oh, good.
Hello, Dr. Whitman. Your speech is very motivational, and I definitely think you should be a speaker
Oh, well, thank you.
professionally. I'm Kathy from Sometry. So we launched a new survey coming out that spoke to over 1,000 professionals in manufacturing. There are a lot of people who are very interested in our industry, but they have not considered manufacturing as their first choice. But once they are in there, they fell into it, especially women. 82% recommend manufacturing as a key sector. From your experience, what are the most effective ways for us to really mobilize and motivate younger generation to consider our industry as their first choice, not by accident?
Not by accident. Well, I mean, I do think it is having mentors, right? Having someone that looks like you or is from the same background, that helps, right? I mean, I think growing up, I never considered medical science. I never even thought about it because I didn't know anyone in that space. And I think if we're going to be more successful, I think it was said this morning, so plagiarize that, but I think if we are going to serve our entire population, we should have engineers and scientists that look like the world population. So I think that's part. We start making sure that we're hiring into our medical device industry from around the world, from different socioeconomic backgrounds, from different racial and ethnic backgrounds. Making people come to Minnesota sometimes is a hard ask, right? If you come from like the South, but I think that's part of it. We have to start looking like, oh my word, I belong here too.
Hi, Gwen Fisher from the university. You have had a ton of experience collaborating from an industry perspective with the university and probably with other universities as well. I'm curious if you've got any lessons learned from those interactions and ways for us all to make that a more efficient and better relationship.
Well, I will say getting involved, I mean, the classwork that we do together, some of it is just FaceTime. So like the design of medical device classes, that, it's a little bit of skin in the game. It allows industry or, engineers to come in and work with professors and students, and it is a win-win. We see what's new. The university is, my job is supposed to be thinking 10 years out. The university thinks 20, 30 years out, right? You're not constrained many times by some of the same constraints as industry is. So I guess that's my first, is that get some skin in the game, and I think things like, supporting a design class is a very easy entry point. So that's one example. It's always hard. I think like the University of Minnesota has been a great partner also with how we bring devices to market. Many times, I think it's hard on the intellectual property side and sometimes the contract side to figure out how to make that all work and move together. But we've had success at the University of Minnesota making that happen with our collaborators. And some of it is like the sheer will of wanting to make it happen, right? Having a champion.
Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful talk. I'm a researcher from Mayo Clinic. My name is Paulami. And I think my question is continuation what you are saying now. So in academia and in industry, the work is very different. Like what we do in research lab and what goes into the production for the patient to use, it's very different kind of research. So can you please tell that what is the difference as you have exposed both of them?
Yeah, I don't know if I'll answer this directly, but we don't, or my research group doesn't usually invest in very basic science. It's very translational usually, the work that we're doing. On the other hand, in order to understand the translation or some of our therapies and where they fit, we will invest in some of that science. I think where the overlap too, in academia, a lot of you're measured many times on the money you bring in as well as the papers you write, and the journal articles that you create. That is also currency for industry as well, right? In order to get devices to market, we have to establish a publication record many times to get reimbursement, right? To show the device is safe and effective. So I think those are where industry and academia can meet up best. It's usually in the translation to into application into the device. So maybe in the preclinical space as well as the clinical space. Does that sort of answer it?
So there is a small little award that comes with this as a reminder of the excellent presentation you gave. So.
Oh. Oh my word, it is big.
I'd like to present you with the 2023 DMD Conference Award winner. Thank you.
Thank you so much.